Thank you, Koert, for this very kind, generous introduction and comforting me that I'm really safe here, unlike in some other places like Malaysia. Thanks to the Tahrir Institute and the European Institute for European Studies for bringing me from Boston and organizing this event. And thanks to you all for coming here and having a few hours together. I'm sure there are fun things out there in Brussels to do, but you prefer to be here, so thank you for that as well. I'm from Turkey. Tonight I'll speak about Turkey and the Turks, my people. And we're generally nice people, but we have a problem. We can't get along with each other very well. And I'm sure maybe it's not just us, but especially it's, I think, a valid observation for the Turkish society these days. There's actually a joke about this that I like to share. Accordingly, one man was given the blessing to go and visit afterlife, heaven and hell. And he went to heaven, he of course admired it and liked it. Then he went to hell and he saw in hell there are pits and there's fire in them. So people are thrown in them and people want to come up, but there are strong guardians of the hell who push them down when they come up. And there was one pit, one big hole, that there was no guardian. And he said, why there's no guardian here? Or they said, oh, it is for the Turks. So he said, so when one wants to come up, the others will pull them down, so we don't need to, guard them and so on and so forth. Well, we sometimes share this, between us as the, brilliant Turkish people, to say that why are we, so at war with each other? Why are we sometimes so bitter against each other? And I think that's nothing genetic or anything, but there's a lot of history behind that. And I want to give you, therefore, a very brief history, overview before coming to today, because I think to understand Turkey's present and future, we have to begin with its past a little bit. So let's begin with the, past. In the beginning, there was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a major empire, one of the world's greatest, stretching from Vienna to Yemen, from Morocco to Iran for centuries. And there are many things great to say about the Ottoman Empire. It was multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. It was pluralist for its time, compared to other empires or other political systems in the world. But the empire collapsed gradually. It began in the 19th century, and ultimately it collapsed fully in World War I. And 27 states emerged from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. Some of them are in the Balkans, countries like Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria. They were all Albania. They were all the Ottoman Empire at some point. What we call the Middle East today, basically North Africa and Middle East, much of what was the Ottoman Empire from Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, all these countries were the Ottoman Empire. And this collapse was painful because most of these newly formed nations were what we call nation states. So Bulgaria is a country for the Bulgarians, right? And it sounded nice, like a moment of national liberation. But for the people who were not Bulgarians, who happened to be in Bulgaria, that was not a great news. Or the same thing for Greece, and ultimately for Turkey as well. I mean, a multi-ethnic empire where you don't have clear boundaries between ethnicities and religious groups and sects, when you tear that apart and create states out of that, you will always end up with minorities. And if those minorities are seen as untrustworthy and suspicious, it will lead to a lot of ethnic cleansings and so on and so forth, and a lot of drama, which I think still explains to us what is happening partly in Iraq and Syria still today, the creation of some states there. This is not a proposal to go back to the Ottoman Empire, but just to understand how things unfolded in the past century. Now, from one of the many nations that emerged out of the Ottomans, one of them was obviously Turkey itself. Turkey itself was founded announced as a republic in 1923 by the war hero which saved Turkey from occupation after World War I, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. His surname was not Atatürk at the time, but Mustafa Kemal Pasha, who would later be named as Atatürk. So Atatürk was Turkey's founder, and he led the war of liberation. He saved the country from occupation by the Greeks and indirectly by the British and the French, and Turkey was under all occupation, and that memory is still very much alive in Turkey. And I think probably all across the board, people respect Mustafa Kemal Pasha for that, for saving Turkey from occupation. But once also Mustafa Kemal Pasha saved Turkey from occupation, he announced a republic, he became the first president, and his party quickly became the only party that is allowed to exist. So Turkey, after independence, became what we call the party state. One party, one state, which was very much the norm in the Arab world until the Arab Spring in most countries. And it is still back to norm, in some countries like Egypt back. But the state and party, one party state, that became the norm in Turkey. And Atatürk established that, plus he initiated what we today call the Kemalists Revolution. What was the Kemalists Revolution? It goes back to the very question why the Ottoman Empire collapsed and why we are lagging behind the West. Different answers were given to this question by late Ottoman intellectual currents. One answer was obviously the Islamist answer, as we say, which is we're not Islamic enough, we're not pious enough, we should go back, revive Islamic glory. And that's still a mood you can find in some conservative circles in today. And the other answer was because of Islam, actually, we became weak. Religion is an obstacle to progress, so we should bring a very hawkish secularism to break the bond of religion on society. We should secularize the society. So that will, make Turkey, the Turks now, move forward. So Atatürk was coming from the secularist tradition in late Ottoman Empire. It was called Garpçılar in late Ottoman Empire, which means the Westernists. Anyway, and he wanted to put this into a political program. So hence came what we call the Kemalist Revolution. And certain aspects of it were certainly positive. I mean, equal rights for women in 1930s who could, reject that. And other modern education, railroads all across the country, things like that. But also Atatürk brought certain cultural reforms that pushed off certain segments of society. One was obviously the laïcité, or laïcité as we call it, that we adopted from France. And that went further than France. That included banning of all traditional religious institutions, all madrasas, if you will, all religious orders. At some point, even banning the recitation of the call to prayer in Arabic. So for Turkey's conservatives, these came as an attack on their religious tradition. So this is number one. The other one was nationalism, Turkish nationalism. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was not a Turkish state. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. Turks happened to be the maybe core of it, but it was not officially Turkish. Turkish Republic became the Turkish Republic. And actually, Atatürk had this famous motto, how happy is the one who says I'm a Turk. So everybody was presumed to be Turkish. And some people had a problem with this, because some people who happened to be in the Republic's borders did not define them as Turks. Some of them defined them as Kurds. So basically, the nationalism of the Republic had the reaction from the Kurds. So basically, we're seeing religious conservatives and Kurds, two important groups in Turkey who had a problem with the founding ideology of the Republic, the Kemalist Revolution. Actually, there's a painting I want to show at this point. Here's this is a painting by Zeki Faik Izer in 1933. You might be familiar with Delacroix and his famous painting of the French Revolution and, the lady with balking with the flag and everything. This is an adaptation from that, obviously. Here you see Atatürk marching, showing the forward, the goal, progress. And there is this Turkish lady, a bit more conservative than Delacroix's, lady, holding a Turkish flag. And they're marching on. Ataturk shows the way and the Turkish nation is moving forward, progress. It all sounds great. But also, see the people on the right side of the screen, the bottom. There are two clerics with beards and turbans. They are being trampled. They're being toppled. So the revolution crushes the clerical establishment. So it's a kind of a very French Revolution idea. And don't forget, the French Revolution brought a lot of reaction from the Catholic Church, which went on for a long time in France. A similar dynamic was triggered by the Kemalist Revolution. That's why in Turkey, the Kemalist Republic, as we call it, began with the Ataturk Revolution, and it softened over time, and I'll explain that. Began with an ideology that didn't fully embrace the whole society, that brought down some top-down reforms, and some people rejected that. The biggest opposition group was religious conservatives, the people who are toppled here. So religious conservatives never fully embraced the Kemalist Revolution, at least not all parts of it. The second big group, as I mentioned, were the Kurds. In Turkey, of course, some Kurds accepted the Turkish identity, they became more assimilated, but let's say ethnically conscious Kurds never fully embraced the nationalism of the Kemalist Revolution. So here you have a Kurdish opposition to the republic, which triggered a lot of revolts, one revolt after another, during the Ataturk time, and then it's culminated into the PKK in 1984, which turned into a terrorist group fighting the Turkish military for decades now. But it's had something to do with the original founding of the republic. So two big groups. There were two other groups that also became oppositional groups in the eyes of the republic. The third group was the Marxists. Because Marxists, although they were not a big influence in the 30s, they gradually became during the Cold War, and Ataturk's republic was destined towards the West. Marxists were seen as pro-Russian or pro-China. Kemalist Revolution was not Marxist, so Marxism became an enemy of the republic. And fourth, the tiniest group, but maybe one of the most vocal ones, the liberals. The liberals were not fancied by the Kemalist Revolution, and the liberals did not like at least some aspects of the Kemalist Revolution. Why? The liberals believed in a limited state governed by rule of law. Kemalism believed in an all-encompassing state transforming society. So for the liberals, the Kemalism was an authoritarian project, although they might agree with some of the content of the authoritarianism there, like equal rights for women, for example. Now, the Kemalist Revolution was most powerful under Ataturk's time. So it was from 1923 to 1938. Like, how many years? 15? Yeah, 15 years. Ataturk remained uncontested in power for 15 years. He passed away in 1938. And then, second, İsmet İnönü replaced him, and it went on for a while. And we should give that credit to the Kemalists of Turkey. They didn't stay forever as a single-party regime, as you saw in the Arab world in many countries. They accepted free and fair elections in 1946. The 46 one was a rigged election, but in 1950, the Kemalists accepted free and fair elections, and Turkey had its first free and fair elections. And guess what? The opposition party won that. The Democratic Party, Demokrat Party, as we say, or Democrat Party. And it's no accident that the Democrat Party get votes from the religious conservatives, mostly, and from other groups that were, unhappy with the republic. And that's why Turkish, I think, history might be divided into the Ottoman era, the first early Republican single-party era, Ataturk and İnönü, and then the democratic era from 1950 to 2000s. I'm not saying 2000s is not democratic, but I'll come to that. But so the second half of the 20th century, basically the Kemalist Revolution softened. Some of the ambitious, crackdowns on religious groups were minimized. Parties like the Democrat Party allowed religious conservatives to become a part of the system, and there emerged an interesting balance. Parties like Democrat Party, and then Justice Party, and then Homeland Party. These are the political line represented by great leaders like Adnan Menderes, Süleyman Demirel, or Turgut Özal, that we broadly call the Turkish Center-Right. The Turkish Center-Right brought the religious conservatives into the system, gave them some freedoms that they wanted, some blessings of the government, but didn't defy the Kemalist Republic, created a middle ground. And I think that middle ground is something we barely miss and lack today in Turkey's political atmosphere. The Kemalist ideology was upheld by the military, who would, if the elected governments went too far, push an elected government out of power. And they notoriously pushed the Democrat Party from power in 1960 and executed Adnan Menderes and two of his ministers, which in Turkey became the big trauma of the conservatives. They elected a prime minister, the military killed him, murdered him basically, out of false accusations. So that's why the grudge within the religious conservatives lived on and on. But there was a balance. Balance between the Kemalist bureaucratic center, the military judiciary, and the religious masses, conservatives, and other groups. In the 2000s, this balance gradually vanished, and we ended up with today a republic dominated by the religious conservatives. And not even all of them, but the major political party and political affiliation among them today led by President Tayyip Erdogan. Now I will explain how this happened a little bit, then I will say a few things about the future of Turkey. The AKP, President Erdogan's party, was founded in 2001, beginning of the century. Of course, it had parties before that. It had precedents. There were other Islamic-leaning parties, but which were always closed down, pushed out of power. The generals were already, always, looming high, and the generals, the secular elites, the judiciary, they could go after the Islamic-leaning political parties. Therefore, the people who founded the AKP in 2001 had a smart idea. They said, okay, we are not doing the old school Islamism anymore. We're not going to say, we want to go back to the Ottoman utopia. We're not anti-Western. We want freedom. We want freedom to wear a headscarf. Isn't that allowed in Europe? Even in France, you can wear a headscarf and go to the campus. And in other parts of Europe, you still, it's not a problem. So instead of seeing Kemalism as an encroachment of the West within Turkey, which they traditionally did, they had a evolution in the late 90s, which culminated in 2000. They said, okay, let's get the Western criteria to Turkey. At the time, I was saying they like the West more than the Westernizers. Westernizers being the Kemalists, because the Kemalists were authoritarian. That gave us the AKP magical, synthesis. Here you had Turkey's religious conservatives aspiring to enter the European Union. And I think Brussels knows this more than any other city on earth, right? I mean, President Erdogan, other people in AKP, they were frequenting Brussels, doing all the reforms required by the European Union. And here was this iconic example of a Muslim Democrat Party finally establishing something like liberal democracy in Turkey. And wow, these are the pious Muslims. Amazing. So this was an idea that I really believed in and promoted, I should say. But I think it was a little, early to guess, where the ultimate story would go. Now, the problem was, I think, in the AKP, the AKP was not just one person. It was a cadre of people. It was a body of important people. There was President Erdogan, who was then Prime Minister, Tayyip Erdogan, and then just one step behind him, there was Abdullah Gül. Just maybe one step behind him, there was Bülent Arınç. There were other important ministers. So it was a party with a lot of important men. And I think some of them really believed in this liberal Islamic synthesis, as I called it at the time. They really believed that we should have the European values. Yes, we should have the Copenhagen criteria. These are good for us. Yes, Islam is already compatible with democracy. I mean, religiously, politically, they figured this out. They really believed in bringing these reforms to Turkey. That's what you can call the moderate wing of the AKP, which was there. It was not fake, which is still out there, by the way. But for others in the AKP, this was just a pragmatic necessity. I mean, what would you do? There was the army on your back. The army had pushed 5 governments in power. I mean, they executed a prime minister. The army is always there. So how do you save yourself from the army, from the military, from its hawkish secular nationalist ideology, really. Europe was the way out. Europe was a life tube. So they pragmatically decided this is the right thing to do at this time. I don't think it was a big conspiracy, as secularists typically believe in, but it was not very principled too. It was politically necessary. But the more the AKP dominated Turkish political system, the less it began to need European values for democracy. Some aspects of the European Copenhagen criteria was still great. I mean, we don't want army to be involved in politics. That's a European criteria? Yes, we like that. But also, journalists should be able to criticize the government in the way they want. That's not that good. You know, it was a selective approach. What can we get out of this? We got what out of this, so we don't need Europe that much anymore. So I think that was a feeling that started to show up in AKP circles by the end of the first decade of this century. In early 2001-11, you started to see that there's less interest in a kind of European-style democracy. Of course, I should add that some European leaders made this transition easy by saying Turkey has no place in Europe, by repeating the classical anti-Turkish or Islamophobic line, saying that Turks will never be a part of our civilization, by dividing us versus them. So that line actually triggered the nationalist nativist line, let's say, I think in the AKP circles. So basically, by 2010-11, the Kemalist bureaucracy, the much feared military, judiciary, the Kemalist elites were defanged. They were not a threat anymore. But the story was only, beginning from a different phase of what I call the revolution, because President Erdogan had allied with an important group to defeat the Kemalists, a powerful Islamic group with a charismatic leader, the so-called Gülenists, or follower of Fethullah Gülen, a cleric who lives in Pennsylvania since 1999 because he had legal troubles in Turkey. He went to U.S. So since then, he's been managing his organization from there. Again, if you go back to 10 years ago, if you were in Brussels, you probably would see AKP and Gülenists as the best friends and allies supporting each other and rallying against the common secular enemy. This was the first phase of that historic revolution. But once the Kemalists were defeated, the two sides realized that they defeated the common enemy. Now, who's the boss? Now, who runs the system? Now, who won? Who's the winner? Who makes the decisions? Erdogan, rightfully, in my view, said, I'm an elected politician. I make the decisions. Who are you? The Gülenists had a very high opinion of themselves because they had big control over bureaucracy, the police, the judiciary, the military. And President Erdogan and the whole AKP had empowered them further, so they were a very important force in the bureaucracy. Therefore, once the Kemalists were out of the picture, we started to see a new battle zone in Turkey, which is AKP versus the Gülenists. And that actually has defined Turkish politics since 2013. The old secular Kemalist elite is not much powerful anymore. They're just basically watching and trying to understand which side is more scary, and they have different opinions about that. But basically, it's become an AKP versus Gülenist political war. Now, some people are surprised by that. They say, how is that possible? Aren't they all conservative Muslims? Aren't they both Sunni? And yes, they are, but remember Stalinists and Trotskyites. People, can be in the same ideological pathway, but they can hate each other more than anything else they might have accomplished a revolution together, but then it doesn't change the fact that, things change differently. How did this battle go? The Gülenists were given by AKP the police intelligence to wiretap people, and they used that aggressively against secularists in 2000s, 2007, even with forged evidence. We have a lot of evidence of that right now. But they were wiretapping not just the secularists, but AKP as well, just in case. So when the two sides went against each other, the Gülenists, by using their elements in the bureaucracy, began a campaign by unveiling some corruption, by some shady deals in Syria, and so on and so forth, which may have some fruit, but it also looked very much trumped up and with the political intention to weaken, destabilize the government, in particular Erdogan. And after that, Erdogan condemned them as enemies of Turkey, Trojan horse, and the fact that Gülen is based in the US made the argument that they are working on behalf of the West, America, CIA, much more persuasive. So that's why Erdogan supporters have condemned Gülen supporters as like Zionist spies in Turkey, basically. Gülenists responded by depicting AKP as Iranian spies, and I remember saying that this is all nonsense, you're just Turks fighting each other as always, but they didn't want to see it that way, they wanted to put it in more cosmic terms. Which brought us, and this dynamic brought us to the coup attempt of 2016. When that coup attempt took place, and first of all, I should say that probably there are people who think, was it a real coup? I mean, some people in the West suspect whether it was a fake thing or a Reichstag fire, you know, with the certain intention of, I think it was a real coup attempt. Turkey barely survived that. If it succeeded, things would be much worse probably. And I do believe, yes, Gülenists in the military were the main component of that. There's many evidence for that. Which doesn't mean that a teacher in a Gülen school today should be seen as terrorist. I don't agree with that very broad definition of terrorism now imposed on the group. But it does mean that the group, its leader, its top executives, and its all its covert organization in the state has a lot to account for. So Turkey has a legitimate case to, you know, go after them, but not in the way of seeing everybody who likes Gülen as a religious leader as a terrorist. So there needs to be more nuance there. After the coup, there was a moment of national reconciliation because the opposition parties stood up against the coup as well. That was a great moment. I mean, the main Kemalists stood up. I mean, the CHP, main opposition, stood up against the coup. The Kurdish party stood up against the coup. It was just a few months of nice kumbaya, we are all good and we love each other. It's only the terrorists and the coup makers we're against. But in Turkey, these things last very short, and it lasted very short. And in a couple of months, you know, the dynamic began again, the dynamic of polarization. And after that, President Erdogan was able to pass a major constitutional amendment in April 2017, like a year ago. This constitutional amendment practically gave the elected president, in this case President Erdogan, the power to control all the executive, if his party wins elections, all the legislation, and all the top judiciary as well. So, you know, since Montesquieu, people are speaking about separation of powers as a foundation of democracy. In Turkey, it more looks like a unification of powers. A principle also Ataturk liked a lot and, you know, accomplished in his day. And President Erdogan began to present himself as the second Ataturk, the second founder and savior of the nation. He said he's fighting the second war of liberation against Western spies and #1 Gülenists, but others, and so on and so forth. And his political narrative came to a very blunt and, you know, impressive form of populism. And I want to stress this term because, you know, populism is a very fashionable concept these days. We see populism in Turkey, we see populism in Hungary, in Poland, even in France, although it didn't win elections. In the US, it did win elections, you know, like there's a whole populism thing going on in the world. And I think Turkey today is very interesting to see, yeah, what is this populism is, yeah, what it really does, and what it can come to. I think in that sense, Turkey is interesting. What is populism? So I'll now show you a little clip, but wait a minute for that. First of all, Jan Werner Müller has a great book on, actually titled, What is Populism? And he says populism has a main claim. And that main claim is that not all of the people are really the people. Like, populists stand for the people, right? I mean, populist means the people. Populis, it comes from Latin, the people. But the people they are cheering for and standing for is not the total sum of the society. There is the real people, and there are the riffraff, or enemies within, or Trojan horses, that we want to get rid of, or we want to minimize our influence on society. There are the real people, typically the heartland people, the traditional people with the classic values and ethnicity and all that. And there are the immigrants, or there are the degenerate cosmopolitans, or the liberals, or Soros-funded something, you know, like these people that are not, they're not the people are our people. Now, this is so much in your face in Turkey. President Erdogan always honors the nation and praises the nation and speaks in name of the nation. I like that. But when you read the pro-Erdogan media, you figure out that the nation is pretty much those who vote for President Erdogan. Because the opposition parties are all of them somehow serving the evil powers that are conspiring against Turkey. They all are connected to Gülenist somehow, although no party has ever been more connected to Gülenist than the AKP itself in Turkish history, because AKP helped them when they were allies. I mean, the main opposition party, the Kurdish party, which is, they have some ties with the PKK, we should be honest about that, but it is all connected into a big conspiracy of, there are conspiratorial powers against Turkey, all the opposition is in bed with this conspiracy, and there's only one leader who's standing up and defending the nation against this threat, which is supported by 48% of the population, and the 42% makes up the nation. So it's a kind of interesting political propaganda. Do we have a few more? Yeah, we have time. Okay. Now I want to show you, I want to give a sense of this. I will show you a 3-minute video clip. This was a propaganda clip prepared on behalf of President Erdogan, who was then prime minister. He was running for presidential elections in 2014. So you will see the 3-minute clip, and you will see that there are dark forces attacking the Turkish flag. They're trying to tear up the Turkish flag, and the whole Turkish nation is rallying up to save the flag. And President Erdogan is in the air with his voice. You will hear him speak. He's reciting the parts of the Turkish national anthem, which is especially about the foreign attack on the country, on the nation. The Turkish national anthem was written in 1920s by Mehmet Akif Ersoy, a great man I respect. He wrote this when Turkey was really occupied by Greeks and the British, and the Greek army was coming to Ankara, so Turkey was really under threat. So President Erdogan is reciting those lines, and we see the clip. Maybe we can see it now.
Arkadaş, yurduma alçakları uğratma sakın. Siper et gövdeni, dursun bu hayasızca akın. Doğacaktır sana vaat ettiği günler hakkın. Kim bilir, belki yarın, belki yarından da yakın. Ruhumun senden ilahi, şudur ancak emeli. Değmesin mabedimin göğsüne namahrem eli. Bu ezanlar ki şehadetleri dinin temeli, ebedi yurdumun üstünde benim inlemeli. Bastığın yerleri toprak diyerek geçme, tanı. Düşün altındaki binlerce kefensiz yatanı. Sen şehit oğlusun, incitme, yazıktır atanı. Verme dünyaları alsan da bu cennet vatanı. Kim bu cennet vatanın uğruna olmaz ki feda? Şüheda fışkıracak, toprağı sıksan şüheda. Canı, cananı, bütün varımı alsın da hüda. Etmesin tek vatanımdan beni dünyada güda. Ben ezelden beridir hür yaşadım, hür yaşarım. Hangi çılgın bana zincir vuracakmış şaşarım. Kükremiş sel gibiyim. Bendimi çiğner aşarım. Yırtarım dağları, enginlere sığmam taşarım. O zaman vecd ile bin secde eder varsa taşın. Her cerihamdan ilahi boşanıp kanlı yaşım. Fışkırır ruhi mücerret gibi yerden naşım. O zaman yükselerek arşa değer belki başım. Dalgalan sen de şafaklar gibi ey şanlı hilal. Olsun artık dökülen kanlarımın hepsi helal. Ebediyen sana yok, ırkıma yok izmihlal. Hakkıdır hür yaşamış bayrağımın hürriyet. Hakkıdır hakka tapan milletimin istiklal.
Okay. So it is an impressive clip. I mean, you see, I should say, as the Turks, I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I respect the flag, and I remember the War of Liberation. My ancestors died there, so there are some emotions. But to use this as a political party propaganda against other political parties, that's wrong. That is wrong, but that's what's happening. And only one side is patriotic, the other one is treacherous. That is the political narrative, and that's wrong. You see the people being mobilized. So mobilization is a very strong concept in Turkey. And this happened with the coup, of course, people going out in the streets defending, and they were heroic people who actually gave their lives to, stood up against the tanks. That was not appreciated enough, I guess, in the West. But now there is this very tense environment, and this polarization is what keeps actually President Erdogan going and actually popular. So today, where we are. Today, we are just 2 months before elections. So there will be elections on, as you said, June 24. President Erdogan is, of course, the biggest contender. I'll tell you one thing. In Turkey, elections are real. Like, there are countries where there's a president, he always wins by 98% of the votes. No, Turkey's not that. Turkey's not that bad. Elections are real. They're contested. And that's why President Erdogan's vote fluctuate. At some point, it went to 40. He barely got the referendum. We will see what happens now. However, while the ballots are not rigged, the propaganda scene is certainly unfair. Clips like this are all in the air everywhere in Turkey. The media is probably 90% pro-government now. And there are a few vocal opposition newspapers, and they have some writers in jails and journalists in jail. And so they are barely trying to survive. Only social media is, right now, kind of an even space, but there's not enough people who use that to make a big change. So I wouldn't be surprised if President Erdogan, wins the January 24 elections again. Actually, these days, it's very hot in Turkey, like who will be the opposition party, will the opposition parties unite? These discussions have been going on, but I wouldn't be surprised if President Erdogan wins the elections in January. I wouldn't be surprised if he wins the elections 4 years from now. I wouldn't be surprised if he wins the elections 8 years from now. It is possible that President Erdogan can really, rule Turkey as long as, his health allows, basically. And that can be like a decade or so on and so forth. Now, therefore, what is the future of Turkey? Well, there are a few options. One is, I might be wrong, and President Erdogan might lose an election, and, some new party comes to power. That's not impossible. That's not impossible this summer. That's not impossible maybe 3-4 years later. So that will be a peaceful transition of power, which would be great, and I would love to see that. And I would oppose any, unpeaceful transformation of power, peaceful democratic transformation of power. That's a dream, good scenario. In that case, the conservatives' exuberance of taking the country back will have calmed down, and you will have another era of some moderation. That's a good scenario. The other two scenarios is that President Erdogan might go for another decade, maybe more. So if we can go through a whole and Erdogan is already now has ruled more than Ataturk. So 15 years so far. He can go for, let's say, 10, 15 years. At the end of which, again, there might be a moderation. You know, people can say, okay, we had the Kemalist conservatives in power, we had the we had the Kemalists in power, we had the revenge against that by the religious conservatives. Now some moderation, some middle ground. That's the good scenario. The other scenario, the third one, is that Erdogan can stay in power that long and can transform Turkey so much that it can be a permanent system from then on. Ataturk did that. Ataturk died, but he left behind a system. The Kemalist Republic lived for a century after him. Not century, but let's say 6, 7 decades after him. So if Erdogan transforms Turkey so fundamentally that it can become a permanent state system with an army and guards and all of that and so on and so forth. I would certainly not want to see that. But in any case, Turkey's future is still unknown. There's no certain course. And I would like to finish by just say a few things to Western policymakers and intellectuals. There are voices in the West, like, what do we do with Turkey? And I see voices saying, oh, Turkey should be out of NATO, Turkey should be out of the European Union, Turkey is violating all the human rights and freedom of speech and everything. Much of those criticisms are valid. Turkey is violating, freedom of speech as it is understood in liberal democracies and rule of law, if you ask me. However, I believe in trying to keep Turkey in the Western sphere as much as possible, because the alternative will be worse. It is important that Turkey is still a member of Council of Europe, and ultimately the European Court of Human Rights have a say on Turkey's legal decisions, which is important. We should preserve that. It is ultimately better for me to be an ally of NATO rather than the Russian military and system, so on and so forth, because military is military. But the alternative would be Turkey becoming a total ally of Russia and the Shanghai Union, Russia, China, these powers. And I don't think President Erdogan has a decision to go that way, but it can go anywhere. So therefore, it is important to try to preserve connections between Turkey and the European Union. Second, Turkey's rulers today and Turkey and their supporters really do believe in a Western conspiracy against Turkey. They honestly believe in this. This is partly part of ideological bias, paranoia. This is partly because of Western double standards against Turkey sometimes. This is partly because the West doesn't want to understand some of Turkey's legitimate causes. For example, the Kurdish militia that the United States armed in Syria is the extension of PKK. And that is, for Turkey, PKK is a terrorist organization. I mean, that is very clear. The US foreign policymakers decided to say, no, they're not PKK, they're not the same thing, so we don't worry about that. Well, when you do that, you will have a nationalist reaction in Turkey, and not just by supporters of President Erdogan, by main opposition as well. The Kurdish question, broader in Turkey and in the region, needs a political solution. I believe in that. But that political solution will come when Western powers understand that Turkey cannot seek a political solution and also be bombed at the same time. So you need to build bridges. And not understanding Turkey's, let's say, security concerns there will not help. Therefore, I urge Western leaders to take a more moderate view of dialogue and trying to keep Turkey within the, let's say, democratic world. Also, I have a suggestion to Turkey's opposition too. They're not here probably, but Turkish opposition should also understand that Erdogan's popularity is sustained by bitter polarization. So they should not sustain the polarization. They should try to bring some moderation into it. People who support President Erdogan think that if Erdogan goes, the dark days of the harshly secular republic will come back. No, they should be given the guarantee that, no, Turkey will not be anything like that again. You will be always able to wear your headscarf from now on. Nobody will treat you like a second-class citizen for that. Those bad days were wrong. They will not come back. We need just a better future for a whole nation, which is all the colors. So I believe we barely also need moderate opposition. opposition is disorganized, but also sometimes very bitter and revengeful, and that revengefulness plays into this. Therefore, basically, I think more moderation from all sides will make things better, and more polarization, more chest beating, more hatred and anger by parties involved will make Turkey only worse. Thank you so much for your attention.